Welcome to my channel. My friends, family, I want to remind you of something powerful. When you stop worrying and start trusting God, that's where fear ends and miracles begin. Stop worrying. Fear steals peace and faith. Worry is one of the most common emotions we all deal with, yet it is one of the most destructive. It disguises itself as preparation, as responsibility, or as care, but in reality, it is simply fear in a quiet disguise. When we allow worry to take root in our hearts and minds, it becomes a thief that robs us of peace, joy, and the faith we need to live courageously. It is subtle, but its impact is powerful. You don't notice the weight right away, but over time it begins to bend your shoulders and cloud your vision. It is like carrying invisible chains, binding your spirit when God has called you to walk free. Think about how worry starts. It is rarely sudden. It begins with a thought of what if? What if things don't work out? What if I'm not good enough? What if I fail? That whisper grows louder the more we feed it. Instead of trusting what God says about us, we replay the lies that fear plants in our minds. We start meditating not on promises, but on problems. Soon our hearts are restless, our sleep is broken, and our spirit feels disconnected. Worry doesn't just sit still, it multiplies. It spreads, and it infects every area of life. Peace, on the other hand, is one of the greatest gifts God has given. It is not simply the absence of conflict, but the assurance that no matter what happens, we are safe in His hands. Peace is what allows someone to smile in the middle of uncertainty. It is what keeps a mother strong when her child is sick, what holds a family together when bills pile high, what gives courage to a leader when the path forward isn't clear. Peace is a promise, but worry is the enemy of that promise. The moment we surrender to fear, peace begins to slip away. Our thoughts get noisy, our hearts restless, and suddenly we can no longer hear the still, small voice of God whispering, "Be still and know that I am God." Faith is the foundation of everything we believe. Without faith, we cannot see the unseen or trust the promises that have not yet come to pass. Faith is what moves mountains, what opens doors, and what draws miracles into our lives. But worry is toxic to faith. Worry and faith cannot coexist in the same heart. One will always silence the other. If faith is the spark that lights our way, worry is the wind that tries to snuff it out. Every time you let fear dominate your thoughts, you weaken the power of faith to operate in your life. It is not that faith disappears, but it becomes buried under the weight of anxiety. When fear steals peace, it also disrupts our connection with God. Worry says, "I must figure this out by myself." Faith says, "I know God already has a plan." The more we worry, the more we carry burdens that were never ours to hold. We step out of trust and into self-dependence, forgetting that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. Worry convinces us that the problem is bigger than the promise. It creates distance from the very source of our strength. Prayer becomes harder because our minds are so consumed with scenarios and outcomes that we cannot quiet ourselves long enough to hear God's reassurance. Instead of sitting at His feet like Mary, we become distracted like Martha, running around in circles while peace slips quietly through the door. Imagine your heart as a home. Peace decorates the walls, faith fills the rooms, and joy sings through the windows. But when worry enters, it rearranges everything. It pushes peace into the corner, it silences the sound of joy, and it locks faith in the back room where it can't be heard. Slowly, the home that was meant to be a sanctuary turns into a prison, and the one who suffers most is you. That is why it is so important to guard your heart against worry, because once it takes root, it grows like weeds, choking out everything good that God planted there. Fear is always future focused. It feeds on the unknown. It cannot survive in the present moment because right now, in this very breath, God's grace is enough. But fear pushes us into tomorrow, into things that haven't even happened. It paints pictures of disasters that may never come, and it convinces us to live through pain that doesn't exist. In doing so, it steals today's peace. How many nights have been lost to tossing and turning over something that never came to pass? How many days have been wasted rehearsing problems that never showed up? That is the cruel trick of worry. It robs the joy of today with the threat of a tomorrow that may never happen. Faith, by contrast, also looks ahead, but with expectation. Where fear says, "What if I fail?" Faith says, "What if I soar?" Where fear says, "What if I'm rejected?" Faith says, "What if I'm chosen?" Faith imagines the possibilities of God's goodness and welcomes them with open arms. Fear shrinks your vision. Faith expands it. Fear makes you look at the size of the mountain. Faith makes you look at the size of your God. But worry, left unchecked, always sides with fear, and that's why it is so dangerous. It doesn't just trouble your mind, it weakens your belief. Even physically, worry takes its toll. Doctors will tell you that stress and anxiety can cause sickness, tension, fatigue, and even shorten your life. Fear is not just a spiritual thief, it is a thief of health, energy, and vitality. Peace, on the other hand, calms your spirit and strengthens your body. There's a reason scripture says a joyful heart is good medicine. Faith doesn't just heal the soul, it lifts the body as well. The weight of fear makes you wary, but the lightness of peace renews your strength. The truth is, everyone worries at some point. Even the strongest in faith face moments of doubt, but the difference lies in what you choose to do with that worry. Do you allow it to spiral into fear, or do you hand it over to God? Fear steals peace and faith only if you let it linger. If you catch it early and replace it with trust, you can break the cycle. That's why the word tells us to take every thought captive. Don't allow fear to plant seeds unchecked in your mind. Uproot them the moment they appear. Speak truth where worry whispers lies. Remind yourself daily that God has not given you a spirit of fear, but a power, love, and a sound mind. When you stop worrying, you reclaim what fear tried to steal. You take back your peace, which guards your heart and mind like a shield. You take back your faith, which opens doors to miracles and breakthroughs. Worry will always knock, but you don't have to let it in. You don't have to rehearse its stories or entertain its predictions. You can choose instead to meditate on God's promises, to anchor yourself in His word, and to remind yourself that the one who calmed the storm with a word is still in control today. The more you practice letting go of worry, the stronger your faith grows. It's like exercising a muscle. Every time you choose faith over fear, peace over panic, trust over turmoil, you become stronger in spirit. You begin to recognize the lies of worry more quickly and silence them more easily. Fear loses its grip and peace becomes your natural state. Soon, your heart is not easily shaken by circumstances because it has learned to rest in the presence of God. And when peace fills your life, everything shifts. Relationships become healthier because you are no longer projecting fear onto others. Decisions become clearer because your mind is not clouded with anxiety. Your vision becomes sharper because faith is guiding you instead of fear. Worry may try to steal, but when you refuse to give it room, you find yourself living with a freedom that cannot be explained, only experienced. It is the kind of freedom that allows you to face uncertainty with courage, to walk into challenges with hope, and to endure storms with calm confidence. This is why stopping worry is more than just a mental exercise. It is a spiritual discipline. It is choosing every day to trust God more than your fears, to believe His promises more than your doubts, and to rest in His presence more than in your own strength. Because fear will always try to steal, but it cannot succeed when faith stands guard. And the moment you stop worrying, you begin to taste the peace and the faith that were always yours to carry. Trust God. He holds the outcome, not your fear. This truth is simple to say, but often difficult to live out. Every day, people wrestle with the uncertainty of life, holding on to fear as if it can somehow keep them safe. Fear convinces us that if we worry enough, plan enough, or stress enough, we can control the outcome. But the reality is that fear has never held a future together. Fear has never opened a door, healed a heart, or provided a way. Only God holds the power to guide the story of your life, and only God determines the final outcome. Trusting God means releasing the illusion of control. It means acknowledging that no matter how carefully you plan, life has twists, turns, and surprises that you cannot predict. You may think that fear keeps you ready, but in truth, fear keeps you trapped. It convinces you that the weight of the future is yours to carry when God has already promised to carry it for you. Fear focuses on what might go wrong, but trust rests in the assurance that God knows what He is doing. He has seen the end from the beginning, and nothing catches Him off guard. The outcome is never in the hands of your fear. It is in the hands of the one who created you. When you let fear dictate your choices, you shrink your life. Fear tells you not to try, not to step out, not to believe because the outcome feels uncertain. But the irony is that fear cannot promise you safety. Fear cannot guarantee success. Fear cannot deliver the peace it pretends to offer. It only magnifies your insecurities and holds you hostage to what ifs. Trust, however, leads to freedom. Trusting God allows you to live boldly, to take risks and to step into the unknown because you know that the result doesn't rest on your strength. The outcome is in His hands, not yours. Think about the countless people in Scripture who trusted God when the outcome seemed impossible. Abraham left his home without knowing where he was going, simply trusting that God would lead him. Moses stood before the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army closing in, and while fear screamed that all was lost, God made a way where there was no way. David stood before Goliath with nothing but a sling, trusting that God would deliver victory. None of these stories were safe. None of these outcomes looked certain, but trust carried them through when fear had no answers. Their stories remind us that the outcome was never determined by their fear. It was determined by God's power. Trusting God also requires patience. Fear is impatient. It wants answers now. It wants certainty now. It demands clarity before it will take a step. But God often works in ways that require waiting, stretching, and growing. Trust says, I don't need to know the how because I know the who. Trust doesn't demand a full blueprint before moving forward. It walks step by step, confident that God is faithful to finish what he started. Fear, on the other hand, demands proof before obedience. It stalls your progress because it keeps you waiting for certainty that never comes. But the outcome isn't determined by fear's demands. The outcome rests securely in God's hands, even when the path is unclear. When you trust God, you begin to see setbacks differently. Fear interprets setbacks as failure. It whispers that you've gone the wrong way, that you're not good enough, that the story is over. Trust interprets setbacks as part of the process. It sees delays as preparation, challenges as training, and detours as divine redirection. Trust believes that God can use even the things meant for harm and turn them for good. Fear limits your perspective, but trust expands it. Where fear sees an ending, trust sees a setup for something greater. Many of us struggle to trust God because we confuse his timing with his absence. We think that if the outcome hasn't arrived yet, he must not be working. Fear uses delay to fuel doubt, but trust understands that silence does not equal abandonment. Trust believes that God is orchestrating things behind the scenes that you cannot yet see. It rests in the truth that he is faithful to keep his promises even when the evidence is not visible. Fear makes you panic in the waiting. Trust makes you patient in the process. And while fear is busy creating anxiety, trust creates room for peace. Fear thrives on uncertainty, but uncertainty is also the very place where trust is built. If you knew every outcome in advance, you would never need to trust God. It is in the unknown. In the moments where the path isn't clear, that trust has the chance to grow. Trust is not tested when everything is predictable. It is tested when everything feels shaky. And in those moments, you must decide, will I let fear drive me, or will I let God guide me? The decision doesn't change the fact that he holds the outcome. It only changes whether you experience that outcome with peace or with torment. Trusting God is not blind optimism. It is not ignoring reality or pretending challenges don't exist. Trust acknowledges reality, but chooses to believe that God is bigger than reality. Trust sees the storm, but chooses to rest in the one who calms it. Trust feels the fear, but refuses to bow to it. Trust doesn't deny the difficulty. It simply refuses to let difficulty have the final word. Fear wants to write the end of your story, but God is the true author, and he holds the pen. In everyday life, trusting God looks like surrender. It looks like praying instead of panicking, releasing instead of clinging, and obeying instead of hesitating. It means putting your energy not into controlling the outcome, but into aligning your heart with his will. Fear says, what if I lose? Trust says, even if I lose, God will sustain me. Fear says, what if the door closes? Trust says, if the door closes, God will open another. Fear says, what if I can't handle it? Trust says, God's gracious. The outcome is not secured by your fear. It is secured by his faithfulness. Fear has a way of exaggerating. It magnifies obstacles, amplifies risks, and multiplies doubts. It makes problems look bigger than they are and makes you feel smaller than you are. Trust, however, magnifies God. Trust shifts your focus from the size of the problem to the greatness of the one who is with you. When you trust God, you stop measuring your situation against your own strength and start measuring it against his. And when you do that, you realize that no obstacle is greater than his power, no challenge is greater than his wisdom, and no outcome is beyond his control. The truth is, you are not meant to carry the weight of outcomes. That weight belongs to God. Your role is obedience. His role is results. Fear tries to reverse that. It convinces you to obsess over results you cannot control while neglecting the obedience you can control. Trust flips it back the right way. Trust frees you to focus on doing what you can today, taking the step, saying the prayer, showing up while leaving the outcome in God's hands. Trust doesn't mean passivity. It means releasing control of what you cannot change and faithfully stewarding what you can. Sometimes trusting God feels risky because it requires letting go of what is familiar. Fear clings to the known, even when the known is unhealthy or limiting. Trust dares to step into the unknown because it believes God's promise is greater than the comfort zone. Fear convinces you to settle for less because at least it feels safe. Trust pushes you to pursue more because God is calling you higher. Fear ties you to the past, but trust pulls you toward the future. The outcome isn't in the grip of fear. It's in the hands of God, who knows the plans he has for you. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope in a future. When fear rises, remind yourself that it does not hold the power. It cannot change tomorrow. It cannot secure your future. And it cannot determine your destiny. Only God can do that. Trust is the posture of faith that says, I don't know what's coming, but I know who's with me. And in that posture, you will find freedom from the endless cycle of anxiety and restlessness. Fear will continue to shout, but when you know the outcome rests in God's hands, its voice grows weaker. Trust silences fear because it shifts the authority. Fear no longer gets to dictate your decisions. God does. Fear no longer gets to hold your future. God does. Fear no longer gets to write the ending. God already has. Miracles begin where faith replaces doubt. Every human being knows what it feels like to wrestle with uncertainty, to stand at the edge of possibility and hear the loud voice of doubt saying it cannot be done. Doubt tells you that you are not capable, that the odds are too high, that the obstacles are too strong. Doubt sounds logical, rational, and convincing, but it is the language of limitation. Faith, on the other hand, is the language of the impossible. Faith is what takes a situation that looks hopeless and breathes life into it. Faith dares to believe what the eyes cannot see. And in that very exchange, when doubt is silenced and faith rises, miracles find a place to unfold. Doubt will always come knocking because it is rooted in fear. It feeds on past disappointments, on the times when things did not work out the way you hoped. Doubt holds up your history and tries to use it as evidence that your future will be the same. Faith, however, speaks from a higher place. Faith points not to your record, but to God's record. Faith remembers that he has parted seas, healed the broken, raised the dead, opened blind eyes, and made a way where there was none. Faith draws its confidence not from what you can do, but from what God has already done and continues to do. A miracle is not always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it is quiet, unfolding slowly, almost unnoticed until one day you realize something has shifted. But every miracle requires faith as its soil. Without faith, the seed cannot grow. Doubt is like a drought. It dries up expectation and withers hope. Faith is like rain. It waters the promise and brings it to life. When you choose to replace doubt with faith, you create an environment where miracles are possible. Not because you force them to happen, but because you align yourself with the power of God who makes them happen. Consider the stories of miracles in Scripture over and over. Faith was the key. The woman with the issue of blood believed that if she could only touch the hem of Jesus' garment, she would be healed. Her faith, not her doubt, made room for her miracle. Blind Bartimaeus cried out in faith, refusing to let the voices around him silence his cry for mercy. His faith opened the door for his sight to be restored. The centurion told Jesus that he did not even need to come to his house. Just speak the word, and his servant would be healed. That level of faith amazed even Jesus, and the miracle happened as he believed. None of these stories left space for doubt to dominate. Miracles did not come to those who entertained the endless what-ifs. They came to those who believed even when belief seemed unreasonable. Faith is not the denial of doubt. It is the decision to act in spite of it. Doubt will always whisper. It will always try to argue. But faith does not wait for doubt to disappear. Faith steps forward, even with trembling hands and a racing heart. Faith says, I do not know how, but I trust that God does. Faith is the bridge between where you are and where the miracle is waiting. Without it, you stay stuck on the shore of hesitation. With it, you cross into the place where the impossible becomes reality. Miracles are not bound by size. For some, a miracle may be the healing of a disease or the restoration of a relationship. For others, it may be the courage to get up in the morning after a season of loss, the strength to forgive when bitterness seems easier, or the provision of daily bread when resources seem scarce. Every miracle, big or small, begins in the same place, faith replacing doubt. Doubt looks at the mountain and says, it cannot be moved. Faith looks at the same mountain and says, God can move it, or he can move me to climb it, but either way I will see victory. Doubt is heavy. It burdens your spirit with questions that have no answers and fills your mind with scenarios that rarely come to pass. Faith is light. It lifts your spirit with hope. It clears your mind with assurance. And it fills your heart with expectancy. Where doubt says, this is the end, faith says, this is just the beginning. Where doubt says, you are not enough, faith says, God is more than enough. That shift in perspective changes everything. Miracles happen not because circumstances change first, but because faith changes you first. Faith creates alignment with God's timing and God's will. Doubt resists it, arguing and questioning, demanding explanations. But faith accepts that God's ways are higher than yours, that his timing is perfect. A miracle is not about manipulating God into doing what you want. It is about trusting him enough to let him do what he knows is best. Faith says yes, even when it doesn't understand. Faith waits patiently, even when it would be easier to walk away. Faith praises in advance, knowing the outcome rests in hands stronger than your own. There is also power in the spoken word. Doubt often shows up in what you say. Words like, I don't think this will ever happen, or I can't imagine things changing, reinforce the grip of doubt on your life. Faith, however, speaks differently. Faith declares, I believe God is able. Faith says, I will see goodness in the land of the living. Faith proclaims, this storm will not last forever. The words you choose either water doubt or strengthen faith. And when you begin to speak in alignment with faith, you open the door wider for miracles to manifest. Doubt is isolating. It makes you feel like you are alone in your struggle, that no one understands, that no one else has faced what you face. Faith reminds you that you are never alone, that God is with you, and that countless others have walked the road of doubt and come out on the other side with testimonies of miracles. Surrounding yourself with people of faith can also strengthen your own. Doubt thrives in isolation, but faith thrives in community. When you hear others share their stories of God's goodness, your own belief begins to rise and doubt starts to shrink. Replacing doubt with faith does not mean ignoring reality. It means interpreting reality through the lens of God's power. Reality may say the odds are impossible. Faith says, with God, all things are possible. Reality may say the door is closed. Faith says, God can open doors no man can shut. Reality may say you have nothing left. Faith says, God can multiply even the little I place in his hands. Miracles are not the absence of reality. They are the presence of God within reality, shifting what cannot be shifted by human hands. When faith replaces doubt, you begin to walk differently. You approach challenges not with despair, but with expectation. You pray not as a last resort, but as a first response. You see obstacles not as barriers, but as opportunities for God to show his power. Doubt limits your steps. Faith enlarges them. Doubt makes you retreat. Faith makes you advance. Miracles require forward motion, and faith gives you the courage to move when doubt tells you to stay still. The greatest miracle of all is the transformation of the heart. Doubt hardens the heart, making it cynical, closed, and resistant. Faith softens it, making it open, receptive, and tender toward God's presence. Doubt leaves you bitter. Faith makes you better. Doubt leaves you stuck in questions. Faith releases you into answers. And it is often in the quiet transformation of the heart that the most powerful miracles begin, because when the inside changes, the outside cannot stay the same. Every miracle carries a testimony, a story that declares, faith worked here. And those stories multiply. The faith that carried someone else to their miracle can inspire your own. The faith that carries you today can inspire someone else tomorrow. That is the ripple effect of replacing doubt with faith. It not only brings miracles into your life, but also becomes the evidence that strengthens others to believe for theirs. Doubt isolates and silences, but faith multiplies and speaks. And in that multiplication, miracles spread beyond just one life. Miracles do not begin in comfort zones. They begin in the space where you feel stretched, where you feel vulnerable, where doubt wants to take control. That is where faith has the chance to step in. It does not require perfect belief. It does not require the absence of questions. It requires the willingness to lean on God when everything in you wants to lean on fear. It requires the decision to say, even if I feel doubt, I will not let it rule me. I choose faith. That choice is where miracles begin, not because of your strength, but because of God's. Release the burden. Make room for God's favor. Life has a way of piling weight onto our shoulders. The responsibilities, the expectations, the deadlines, the disappointments, and the fears all build up until the load feels too heavy to carry. Many people wake up already tired, not because of the work of the day, but because of the unseen burdens they have been carrying in their hearts and minds. Burdens of worry, guilt, shame, anxiety, regret, or control. These invisible loads often weigh more than the visible ones, and they rob you of joy, energy, and clarity. The truth is, you were never created to carry all of it. You were meant to release it into God's hands and make space for his favor to flow freely in your life. Carrying burdens comes from the belief that everything depends on you. You think you must hold every detail together, fix every problem, and provide every solution. That mindset creates exhaustion, because no matter how strong or capable you are, life will always present challenges bigger than your own strength. Holding tightly to burdens also blocks the flow of God's blessing, because your hands are too full of what you cannot change to receive what he wants to give. Releasing the burden is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is the choice to say, I don't have to do this all on my own. I trust the one who has greater power, greater wisdom, and greater love than I do. Imagine a traveler walking a long road with a backpack full of rocks. Each rock represents a fear, a mistake, or a worry. At first, the weight seems manageable. But as the journey continues, the backpack grows heavier. The traveler slows down, struggles, and finally collapses under the weight. This is what happens when you carry life's burdens without release. You may survive for a while, but eventually the weight crushes your spirit. God invites you to take off the backpack, to hand over the rocks one by one, and to walk freely again. When you do, your pace quickens, your steps lighten, and suddenly you realize there is room for joy, peace, and blessings to fill your journey. Holding on to burdens also creates clutter in the heart. Just as a room stuffed with unnecessary items leaves no space for new furniture, a heart filled with worry leaves no space for God's favor. Favor often shows up in unexpected ways, but if you are weighed down by the old, you may not even recognize it. Releasing burdens clears the atmosphere of your soul. It creates an openness where peace can settle, where ideas can grow, and where opportunities can take root. The act of letting go becomes the very act that makes room for God to move in ways you could never orchestrate on your own. One of the heaviest burdens people carry is the need for control, the desire to manage every outcome, predict every possibility, and ensure everything works according to plan drains your spirit. Control is exhausting because it fights against reality. There will always be things beyond your reach. Releasing the burden of control does not mean apathy, it means surrender. It is the difference between saying, I must make everything happen, and saying, I will do my part and trust God with the rest. That trust is what positions you for favor because it shifts the weight off your shoulders and onto His. Another burden many carry is guilt or shame. Past mistakes, failures, or wrong decisions can linger like stones in the heart, reminding you of what went wrong. Carrying this kind of burden not only drains your energy, but also blinds you to the grace available now. Releasing that burden means accepting forgiveness, letting go of the past, and believing that God's favor is not dependent on perfection, but on His love. When you release shame, you make space for favor to rebuild your confidence and redirect your path toward new possibilities. Worry is another burden that steals peace and blocks favor. Worry convinces you that constant mental rehearsal of problems somehow keeps you safe, but in reality, it keeps you stuck. Worry consumes time and energy without ever producing solutions. When you release worry, you free your mind to hear God's guidance more clearly. Favor often comes as an idea, an opportunity, or a connection. And when your thoughts are cluttered with worry, you miss the signals. Releasing worry is not irresponsibility. It is a conscious decision to believe that God is already working things out behind the scenes. When you release burdens, something powerful happens inside of you. The heaviness lifts, and you begin to experience a kind of rest that goes beyond physical sleep. It is rest for the soul, rest for the mind, and rest for the spirit. In that rest, your creativity returns, your joy awakens, and your strength renews. This rest is where favor thrives because you are no longer fighting to keep everything together. Instead, you are open, receptive, and available to receive what God has been waiting to give. Releasing the burden is not a one-time act. It is a daily practice. Life will always try to hand you new weights, new worries, new reasons to hold on. Each day you must decide to let them go again, to refuse to pick up what does not belong to you, and to trust that God's shoulders are broad enough to carry what yours cannot. Each time you practice this release, you create fresh space for favor to flow in new ways. The less you cling, the more you can receive. And the more you receive, the more you realize that God's favor is abundant, sufficient, and always waiting for room in your life.